Rome had grown tired of virtue. By the spring of 193 AD, the Eternal City no longer believed in honor, loyalty, or destiny. Those were words carved into old marble, whispered by dead senators, remembered only by statues with broken noses. Real power no longer lived in ideals. It lived in soldiers, in gold, and in fear. The death of Emperor Pertinax had come swiftly and brutally. He had tried to restore discipline, to remind Rome of what it once was. For that mistake, the Praetorian Guard dragged him through the palace corridors and cut him down like a criminal. His blood stained the floors of the imperial residence, and with it died the illusion that Rome still respected merit. That night, the city held its breath. The Praetorian Guard, once protectors of the emperor, locked themselves inside their camp. They were armed, angry, and very aware of the power they now possessed. Rome had an empire, but no ruler. And in that dangerous silence, an idea took shape, simple, ugly, and irresistible. If emperors could be killed, then emperors could be sold. Outside the iron gates of the Praetorian camp, whispers spread through the streets. Senators stayed indoors, merchants closed early. Ordinary Romans sensed something unnatural in the air, like the moment before an earthquake. No one knew who would rule next, only that whoever it was would not rule long. Among the elite of Rome, two men heard the whispers and understood their meaning. One was Titus Flavius Sulpicianus, the city prefect and Pertinax's father-in-law. He had authority, experience, and the appearance of legitimacy. He hurried to the Praetorian camp, hoping to calm the soldiers, to negotiate, to restore order before chaos swallowed the city. The other man listened and smiled. His name was Didius Julianus. Julianus was not young, he was not heroic, but he was rich, very rich. Born into privilege, educated in rhetoric and law, he had spent his life navigating the shifting tides of Roman politics. He had governed provinces, served as consul, and survived decades where sharper men had fallen. He knew one truth better than most. Rome no longer rewarded virtue, it rewarded survival. And survival, Julianus believed, could be bought. As night fell, Julianus was dining calmly when a messenger arrived, breathless, eyes wide with urgency. The Praetorian Guard, the man whispered, were negotiating, not choosing an emperor, selling the throne. Julianus did not hesitate. He rose from the table, wrapped himself in a cloak, and ordered his servants to prepare his litter. The streets were dark as he was carried toward the Praetorian camp, torchlight flickering against stone walls that had witnessed centuries of triumph and betrayal. Each step brought him closer to a gamble that would either make him emperor or get him killed. Inside the Praetorian camp, Sulpicianus was already speaking to the soldiers. He appealed to duty, to stability, to Rome itself. The guards listened, but their faces were unreadable. They had tasted power, and power had changed them. Then Julianus arrived. The guards recognized him immediately, a former consul, a wealthy aristocrat, a man who looked like he belonged on a throne, even if he had never earned it. They allowed him to speak, and Julianus did not talk about Rome. He talked about money.
He offered each Praetorian soldier a sum so large it bordered on madness, far more than any emperor had ever promised. The camp erupted into shouting. Sulpicianus raised his own offer, desperate not to lose. Julianus raised his again, calmly, confidently, like a man bidding on property rather than an empire. The throne of Rome became an auction. From the walls of the camp, soldiers shouted the numbers into the night so that all could hear. Citizens nearby stood frozen in disbelief. This was not conquest, this was not destiny, this was commerce. At last, the guards made their choice. Gold spoke louder than blood. The gates opened and Julianus was escorted inside. Sulpicanus was dismissed, defeated not by politics or law, but by a higher bid. Before dawn, the Praetorian Guard proclaimed Didius Julianus Emperor of Rome. Inside the Senate House, fear replaced debate. Senators knew what had happened, and they hated it, but they also knew the guards were watching. When Julianus entered, surrounded by armed men, the Senate voted as expected. Acclamations echoed hollowly. Titles were granted mechanically. Rome had a new emperor. But outside, the city did not celebrate. Crowds gathered in the streets, not cheering, but cursing. They shouted insults, threw stones, called Julianus a thief, a merchant, a disgrace. For the first time in generations, Rome looked at its emperor with open contempt. Julianus heard them. That night, alone in the palace, wearing imperial robes that felt heavier than armor, he understood a terrifying truth. He had bought the throne, but he had not bought loyalty. Not from the people, not from the Senate, and perhaps not even from the soldiers who sold it to him. Far beyond Rome, on distant frontiers, powerful generals would soon hear the news. Men with legions, men who did not need to buy power because they already commanded it. And when they marched, gold would not save him.
Morning arrived without mercy. The sun rose over Rome as it always had, lighting temples, forums, and crowded streets. But this morning, it revealed something new, an emperor no one respected. From the moment Didius Julianus stepped onto the palace balcony, he felt it. The silence below was not reverence, it was judgment. The people stared up at him with folded arms and narrowed eyes. Some spat on the ground, others muttered curses loud enough to be heard. Julianus lifted his hand in a traditional gesture of greeting, but the crowd did not answer. A few stones clattered against marble steps. The Praetorian Guard tightened their grip on their weapons. This was not how emperors were welcomed. Inside the palace, Julianus tried to act like a ruler. He summoned advisors, issued decrees, ordered sacrifices to the gods. But every action felt hollow, like a performance staged for an audience that had already walked out. Even the servants avoided his eyes. They had served many emperors. They knew weakness when they saw it. Julianus understood that time was his enemy. He had bought the throne, but now he needed legitimacy. And legitimacy in Rome came from three places: the Senate, the people, and the legions. He had forced the first, he had angered the second. That left the third, and they were very far away. Across the empire, news traveled faster than armies. Messengers rode day and night, carrying the incredible story of how Rome's highest power had been auctioned like a slave. In military camps along the frontiers, soldiers listened in disbelief, then in rage. To them, emperors were made by victory, not coin. In Pannonia, on the Danube frontier, one general listened in silence. His name was Septimius Severus. Severus was everything Julianus was not. Hardened by war, respected by his men, feared by his enemies, he commanded legions that had spent years fighting barbarians. When he heard that the Praetorian Guard had murdered Pertinax and sold the empire, his response was cold and immediate. He would march on Rome, not as a bidder, but as an avenger. Back in the capital, rumors began to seep through the palace walls. Julianus heard fragments at first, whispers of unrest, murmurs of loyalty shifting, soldiers swearing oaths to other names. He tried to dismiss them, but fear gnawed at him like a disease. He called the Praetorian prefects and demanded reassurance. They swore loyalty, hands on swords, voices steady. But Julianus noticed how quickly they counted their gold afterwards, how often their eyes drifted toward the city gates. Men who sold power once could sell it again. Desperate, Julianus turned to the Senate again. He promised reforms, generosity, cooperation. The senators listened politely, but behind their masks of obedience lay contempt. They had seen emperors rise and fall, and they sensed that this one would not last. Already some were quietly preparing speeches of loyalty to whoever came next. The streets grew uglier with each passing day. Crowds gathered not in celebration, but in protest. They mocked Julianus openly, calling him the merchant emperor, shouting that Rome was no longer ruled by gods or heroes, but by money changers. When Julianus attempted to address them publicly, his words were drowned out by jeers. Once, a rotten vegetable struck his robe. He retreated indoors, shaken. At night, sleep abandoned him. He dreamed of the auction, of soldiers shouting numbers, of gold spilling across the floor, of the throne slipping from his grasp no matter how tightly he held it. He woke drenched in sweat, listening for footsteps that might never come, or might come too soon. Then, the worst news arrived. A messenger from the north, dust-covered and exhausted, was brought before Julianus. He spoke with trembling urgency. Severus had been proclaimed emperor by his legions. The army had sworn to avenge Pertinax. They were already marching south. Rome froze. Julianus felt the room tilt. Severus did not need approval. He did not need gold. He had something far more dangerous: thousands of disciplined soldiers who believed in him. Against that, the Praetorian Guard were nothing more than hired knives. Panic spread through the palace. Some advisors urged negotiation. Others suggested raising more money, offering even greater rewards. Julianus agreed to everything, grasping at hope like a drowning man. He ordered statues erected in his honor, coins minted with his image, proclamations sent across the city declaring Severus a traitor. None of it mattered. The people laughed, the Senate hesitated, and the soldiers listened only for the sound of marching feet. As Severus drew closer, loyalty evaporated. The Praetorian Guard began holding secret meetings. Senators stopped attending palace sessions. Even Julianus's household guards looked uncertain. The emperor who had paid for obedience discovered the truth too late. Fear was stronger than gold. One evening, standing alone in the imperial chambers, Julianus stared at his reflection in a polished bronze mirror. He looked older than he had weeks ago. His eyes were hollow. The purple robe felt like a mockery. He had wanted to be emperor. Now he understood the cost. Outside Rome, the legions were coming, and when they arrived, the empire would demand a price far higher than Julianus had ever paid.
The city began to betray him in small, quiet ways. It started with absences. Senators who once rushed to the palace now sent excuses. Priests delayed sacrifices. Messengers returned late or not at all. Rome was no longer Julianus's capital. It was a stage slowly emptying before the final act. Every sound made him flinch. Footsteps in corridors, distant shouts from the streets, the clatter of armor when the Praetorian Guard changed watch. He trusted none of it. Trust, he had learned, was a luxury for men with legions. Julianus tried to act. He ordered the Praetorian Guard to train publicly, to display strength and loyalty. The soldiers marched through Rome in polished armor, but the display backfired. The people did not feel protected, they felt threatened. Boos followed the soldiers like shadows. Children threw dust. Old men spat curses that carried the weight of memory. Rome had once been ruled by giants, not by guards for hire. Worse still, the guards themselves were uneasy. They had killed one emperor and sold the throne to another. Now they heard that real soldiers, men hardened by years of blood and cold, were approaching. Against legions, gold was useless. Courage could not be purchased. Discipline could not be improvised. Julianus sensed the shift and panicked. He summoned engineers and ordered the city walls reinforced, though everyone knew Rome had not faced a true siege in generations. He commanded the Praetorians to prepare defenses, but their movements lacked conviction. They followed orders because they had been paid, not because they believed. Belief was marching toward Rome from the north. At the same time, the empire itself began to fracture. In the east, another name was spoken with growing confidence: Pescennius Niger. In Syria and the eastern provinces, legions proclaimed him emperor, declaring that Rome had lost its way. They spoke of restoring dignity, of punishing corruption. The empire now had not one emperor, but 3 claimants to power. Julianus stood at the weakest center of them all. He attempted diplomacy, sending letters filled with grand language and desperate promises. He offered alliances, recognition, shared rule, anything that might buy him time. The replies, when they came, were polite and meaningless. No one took him seriously. Why should they? He had not seized power, he had purchased it. As the days passed, Severus's advance became impossible to ignore. Villages fell silent, roads filled with refugees. Traders arrived with stories of disciplined columns moving steadily south, banners snapping in the wind, soldiers chanting Pertinax's name like a prayer and a threat combined. Julianus's advisors argued constantly. Some urged him to flee, others suggested assassination, kill Severus before he reached Rome. Julianus listened, nodded, and did nothing. Every option felt like another trap. At night, he wandered the palace halls, touching the walls as if trying to absorb strength from stone that had outlived countless rulers. He stopped before statues of past emperors, Augustus calm and eternal, Trajan victorious, Marcus Aurelius thoughtful and weary. They seemed to judge him. He wondered briefly whether buying the throne had been a mistake. Then he wondered whether refusing the chance had been worse. Rome did not forgive weakness, but it punished ambition even more brutally. The Senate made its move quietly. One morning, Julianus received word that several senators had left the city for health reasons. He knew what that meant. They were positioning themselves for survival, ready to swear loyalty to whoever entered Rome next. The institution that once ruled the world now existed only to sense the wind and bend accordingly. The Praetorian Guard sensed it too. Their loyalty cracked openly when Julianus proposed marching out to meet Severus, hoping to negotiate or intimidate. The guards protested. Some refused outright. They had not been paid to die against real armies. Murmurs of disobedience spread through the camp like rot. Julianus tried to raise their pay again. It was too late. Gold could no longer compete with fear. One evening, as the city darkened under a sky heavy with clouds, Julianus sat alone at a banquet table meant for dozens. The food went untouched. Music played softly, absurd and distant. He imagined Severus's soldiers eating hard bread by firelight, sharpening blades, confident in tomorrow. Confidence was a weapon Julianus never owned. A final report arrived before midnight. Severus was days away. Towns were opening their gates without resistance. The Praetorian Guard, the messenger added carefully, were uncertain. Julianus dismissed the man and remained seated, staring into a cup of wine that reflected a distorted image of his face. Emperor, thief, victim, fool. The titles blurred together. For the first time since the auction, he understood the full cruelty of his situation. Rome had allowed him to buy the throne so that it would not have to die for him, and now Rome was preparing to watch him fall. Somewhere beyond the walls, the future marched closer with every step, and inside the palace, an emperor waited, alone, unwanted, and already forgotten.
The breaking point came not with violence, but with silence. Julianus awoke to a palace that felt abandoned. The usual sounds of servants preparing the day were muted, distant. When he called for water, it came late. When he asked for news, none arrived. The Emperor of Rome sat at the center of the world and discovered that the world had begun to move on without him. By midday, the streets were unnaturally quiet. No crowds gathered to shout, no protests formed. The city had entered a more dangerous phase, not anger, but acceptance. Romans had learned long ago that survival meant choosing the right moment to stop caring.
Inside the Praetorian camp, decisions were being made without him. The guards no longer spoke of loyalty, they spoke of terms. They knew Severus was close, and they knew what he represented: discipline, revenge, legitimacy born of steel rather than coin. If they resisted, they would be crushed. If they surrendered Julianus, they might yet survive. Julianus sensed it before he was told. He summoned the Praetorian prefects one final time. They arrived slowly, faces stiff, eyes guarded. Julianus tried to speak with authority, but his voice betrayed him. He reminded them of their oaths, of the gold he had paid, of the consequences of betrayal. They listened without interruption. When he finished, one of them answered quietly that the situation had changed. The empire required peace, Rome required stability. Bloodshed would serve no one. Julianus understood what that meant. The meeting ended without threats, without shouting. The guards bowed and withdrew, leaving the emperor standing alone in a room that suddenly felt much too large. He did not call them back. Pride, at least, remained. In the Senate House, fear finally gave way to calculation. The senators gathered, not openly defiant, but resolved. They had endured tyranny before. They had survived worse emperors than Julianus, but this situation was different. Supporting him now meant standing against legions, against inevitability. A motion was proposed quietly, then seconded. Julianus would be declared a public enemy. The empire would recognize a new ruler. The vote passed with minimal debate. When the decision reached the palace, it came not as a decree, but as a courtesy. A former emperor informed that he no longer mattered. Julianus received the message with numb clarity. He did not rage, he did not plead. He asked only how much time he had left. The messenger did not answer. As evening approached, Julianus dressed himself carefully. He chose a simple tunic, not the purple. There would be no performance at the end, no final speech to an audience that had already turned away. He walked through the palace halls slowly, memorizing them. The polished floors, the painted ceilings, the corridors where emperors had plotted, celebrated, and died. Each step echoed as if the building itself were counting down his remaining moments. In a small chamber near the baths, he sat and waited. Outside, Rome prepared for Severus's arrival. Gates were inspected, not to be closed, but to be opened. Citizens whispered prayers not for Julianus's survival, but for an orderly transition. Shops reopened, life resumed. The empire had decided who mattered now. The soldiers came at dusk. They were not brutal, they did not shout, they even did not accuse. Two men entered the room, their expressions grim but calm. One carried a sword, the other carried the weight of history. Julianus rose to his feet. He asked one question, whether Severus would spare his family. No promise was made, but no refusal either. It was enough. He nodded once. There was no trial. There was no crowd. There was only a swift movement, a sharp pain, and then nothing. The reign of Didius Julianus ended after 9 weeks, shorter than a season, lighter than a rumor. When Severus entered Rome days later, he did so not as a conqueror, but as a restorer. The people welcomed him, the Senate applauded him, the Praetorian Guard, stripped of their power, watched in silence as he reorganized them, punished the guilty, and reminded Rome that emperors were not merchandise. Julianus's name faded quickly. Historians remembered him not for laws passed or wars won, but for a single moment, the night when Rome's throne was sold to the highest bidder. His life became a warning, repeated whenever power seemed too easy to obtain. Gold could buy obedience, but it could not buy belief, and in Rome, belief was everything.
After his death, Rome did not pause to mourn. The body of Julianus was removed quietly, without ceremony, without announcement. There were no public rites, no speeches, no statues planned in his honor. By morning, the palace corridors had been washed clean, as if his presence had been a temporary stain, rather than a chapter of imperial history. Rome had perfected the art of forgetting. Yet, forgetting did not come easily to everyone. In taverns and workshops, people spoke of the auction in hushed tones, not with sympathy, but with disbelief. Old men shook their heads and said they had lived long enough to see the empire sold like cattle. Younger Romans laughed bitterly, repeating the story as a dark joke, a warning disguised as humor. Even laughter in Rome carried judgment. When Severus finally entered the city, it was with measured precision. His soldiers marched in silence, armor worn from real battles, faces hardened by years of discipline. There was no chaos, no looting, no wild celebration. This was not a mob claiming victory. This was an army taking responsibility. The contrast was unmistakable. Where Julianus had been escorted by guards who watched the crowd nervously, Severus walked among citizens who leaned forward in relief. He spoke little, but his presence alone restored something Rome had been missing: certainty. The city exhaled. One of his first acts was to deal with the Praetorian Guard. They were summoned not as kingmakers, but as criminals. Those directly involved in the murder of Pertinax were executed. Others were dismissed, exiled, or stripped of their privileges. The Guard was rebuilt from the ground up, filled with soldiers loyal not to gold, but to command. It was a clear message: never again would Rome's throne be sold. The Senate adapted quickly. Speeches were rewritten, praises were redirected. Men who had bowed to Julianus now praised Severus's strength and justice. History in Rome was flexible. Morality adjusted to whoever held power. Yet, among the senators, a quiet unease lingered. They knew what had happened. They knew how close the empire had come to collapsing into permanent corruption. Julianus had not caused the decay, but he had revealed it. Severus understood this too. Privately, he spoke of Julianus not with rage, but with contempt mixed with grim appreciation. The man had been foolish, yes, but he had also exposed a weakness that could no longer be ignored. In that sense, Julianus had forced Rome to confront itself. Beyond the capital, the empire continued to tremble. In the east, rivals still gathered strength. In distant provinces, governors watched carefully, measuring Severus's resolve. The civil wars were not yet over. Blood would still be spilled, but Rome now had a center again, a gravity that pulled power back toward order. Julianus became a footnote even as his consequences lived on. His family survived, quietly withdrawing from public life. His wealth was seized, redistributed to the state and the army that now controlled it. His name disappeared from inscriptions. Coins bearing his image were melted down, reshaped into symbols of a new reign. But stories do not melt so easily. Years later, teachers would still mention him when warning students about ambition without strength. Philosophers would debate whether Julianus was a villain or merely a product of a broken system. Soldiers would tell the tale around campfires, laughing at the idea that an emperor once tried to buy what they knew must be taken. The throne, they would say, is not furniture. It does not belong to whoever can afford it. It belongs to whoever can hold it. In that truth lay the final judgment on Julianus's life. He had not been evil. He had not been cruel. He had not even been especially incompetent. His greatest sin was believing that Rome could be treated like property, that power could be acquired without loyalty, that fear could be replaced with coin. Rome taught him otherwise. Long after Severus's banners had faded, long after new emperors rose and fell, the memory of that single night, the auction, remained. It haunted the empire like a scar that never fully healed. Whenever corruption grew too bold, someone would whisper Julianus's name as a reminder of how fragile authority truly was. Not all emperors are remembered for conquest. Some are remembered as warnings. And in the endless story of Rome, Didius Julianus became exactly that. A man who proved at the cost of his life
that an empire can survive bad rulers, but it cannot survive believing that power is for sale.
Time moved forward, but the shadow of that spring never fully left Rome. Under Severus, order returned with iron certainty. Laws were enforced, the army was strengthened, borders were secured with campaigns that reminded the world Rome still knew how to fight. Yet beneath the renewed discipline, something had shifted forever. Trust, once broken, never returned in the same shape. The people remembered. They remembered how quickly the Praetorian Guard had turned from protectors into merchants. They remembered how the Senate had bowed to fear without protest. And they remembered Julianus, not as a monster, but as evidence of decay. Rome had not fallen that year, but it had looked into the mirror and seen its own weakness reflected back. Severus ruled with that knowledge close to his heart. He centralized power, reduced the Senate's influence, and tied the empire more tightly to the army. Some called him a tyrant, others called him a savior. Most simply accepted that Rome had entered a new phase, one where strength mattered more than tradition and loyalty mattered more than lineage. In the provinces, the story spread like a lesson carved into stone. Governors understood now that Rome would no longer tolerate hesitation. Legions swore oaths more carefully. Commanders watched their men more closely. The idea that the throne could be bought faded into disbelief, then into legend. Children heard it as a cautionary tale, half amused, half afraid. But legends have a way of shaping reality. Years later, when corruption surfaced, when officials grew too comfortable, someone would inevitably recall Julianus, not with anger, but with a knowing sigh. He became a symbol of what happened when institutions failed and opportunists stepped into the silence. In private moments, Severus sometimes reflected on the man he had replaced. He did not excuse him, but he understood him. Julianus had lived in a Rome that rewarded survival over courage, wealth over honor. He had simply pushed those values to their logical conclusion. In doing so, he exposed a truth Rome preferred to ignore, that empires rot not from invasion, but from compromise. The palace where Julianus had waited for death continued to stand. New emperors walked its halls, issued orders, received applause. Yet the walls remembered. They always did. Stones absorb history even when people try to erase it. One evening, years later, Severus stood alone in those corridors, listening to the echoes. Power surrounded him, real power, earned and enforced. And yet he knew how fragile it all was. One bad decision, one weak successor, one night of fear. Rome did not collapse because of Julianus, but Julianus proved it could. And that knowledge became part of Rome's inheritance, passed down with the crown, heavier than gold, sharper than any blade. Years passed, and Rome learned to live with the memory rather than fight it. Under the new order, the empire hardened. The army became the spine of authority, and politics bent around it like soft metal. Senators spoke more carefully. Governors ruled more decisively. Everyone understood that hesitation invited disaster. The auction of the throne had become an unspoken reference point, a moment everyone remembered but few dared to name aloud. For the common people, life went on. Markets opened at dawn, ships arrived at the ports, grain was distributed, taxes were collected, festivals were held. On the surface, Rome looked eternal again. But beneath that rhythm lay a subtle tension, a sense that stability now depended on strength alone, not shared belief. In quiet corners of the city, storytellers still spoke of that strange emperor who had lasted less than a season. They described him not as a tyrant, but as a man out of time, a man who tried to solve a military problem with money, a political crisis with bargaining, and a moral collapse with convenience. Some listeners laughed, others grew uneasy, because too many recognized themselves in him. Julianus had not been alone in his thinking. He was simply the one who acted. Many men in Rome had wealth. Many believed power could be negotiated. Many had watched institutions weaken and told themselves it was temporary. Julianus became the symbol so that others could pretend innocence. As new emperors rose, they spoke often of discipline and loyalty.
They punished corruption loudly, publicly, yet corruption never vanished. It only learned to hide better. Gold continued to flow through Roman politics, quieter now, more careful, always careful not to be seen bidding openly for power again. The army watched everything. Veterans told younger soldiers stories of the year when Rome nearly tore itself apart without a single foreign enemy crossing its borders. They spoke of how quickly fear spread, how fast loyalty dissolved when belief vanished. Those stories shaped men more deeply than speeches ever could. And slowly, the meaning of Julianus changed. He was no longer just the man who bought the throne. He became a lesson about timing, about context, about the danger of mistaking opportunity for destiny. Philosophers debated whether he was responsible for his fall or merely a mirror held up to a broken system. The debate never ended. In distant provinces, far from Rome's marble and memory, officials occasionally tried to rule by bribe rather than authority. When they failed, when rebellions erupted or soldiers deserted, someone would always remark that Rome had seen this before. The past, after all, never truly leaves an empire. It waits. Even the Praetorian Guard, rebuilt and restrained, never regained their former arrogance. Their camp remained, their duties continued, but their legend had been shattered. They were no longer feared as kingmakers. They were watched closely. Severus had made sure of that. Yet history is patient. Decades later, as emperors weakened again, as successions grew uncertain, echoes of that long-ago auction resurfaced in subtler forms: promises, incentives, quiet negotiations. Never as crude as before, but unmistakably familiar. Rome had learned the lesson, but learning was not the same as changing. In the end, Julianus's greatest impact was not his reign, but his exposure of a truth Rome could never unsee. Power without legitimacy rots quickly, and legitimacy without force dissolves just as fast. Balance was everything, and balance was fragile. Long after his name faded from monuments, it survived in cautionary whispers. Parents warned sons not to believe wealth alone could command respect. Teachers reminded students that history punished shortcuts more harshly than failure. And emperors, no matter how strong, remembered. Because somewhere in the vast machinery of Rome's memory, one brief reign stood as proof that the empire could survive invasion, famine, and war, but not the moment when it forgot what power truly cost.
As generations turned, Rome wrapped the memory of Julianus in layers of distance, but distance did not erase meaning. It softened edges, blurred faces, yet the core remained sharp. The empire moved forward, carrying a quiet awareness that legitimacy was not a gift, it was a burden that had to be carried every day. Young officials entering public life heard the story early, not from formal lessons, but from sideways remarks, from mentors lowering their voices at banquets, from veterans who had learned the cost of confusion. The lesson was always the same, though phrased differently each time. Never confuse permission with loyalty, and never mistake silence for consent. Rome had become wiser, but also more cynical. Public virtue returned as performance. Emperors spoke of justice, of tradition, of destiny. Coins bore idealized images. Monuments rose, proclaiming stability and eternity. Yet everyone understood the hidden truth. Authority rested on readiness, on speed, on the willingness to act decisively before doubt could spread. That truth shaped everything. When crises came, rulers moved faster. When rumors surfaced, they were crushed early. The empire no longer allowed power vacuums because everyone remembered what filled them. The auction of the throne was no longer possible, not because Rome had become purer, but because it had become afraid of repetition. Fear, once learned, rarely fades. In private correspondence, some thinkers argued that Julianus had been inevitable, that a system built on compromise, wealth, and survival would eventually produce a man who treated power like a transaction.
His failure, they argued, was not moral but structural. He acted honestly within a dishonest world. Others rejected that view entirely. They insisted Julianus had crossed a line that should never be crossed, regardless of circumstance, that some actions once taken could not be justified by decay, that Rome fell a little that night, even if it did not collapse. The argument echoed through centuries. Meanwhile, life continued in practical ways. Roads were built, borders shifted, wars were fought and forgotten. New emperors rose who had never seen Julianus's face, never walked the halls where he had waited for death. And yet, without knowing it, they ruled in his shadow, because the rules had changed. Power was no longer something to inherit calmly, it was something to secure actively. Succession became a dangerous moment, watched closely by soldiers, politicians, and rivals. No emperor assumed smooth transition anymore. Preparations began early, alliances were reinforced, potential threats were neutralized quietly. Rome had adapted. But adaptation always has a cost. The Senate, once the heart of Roman political identity, became increasingly ceremonial. Its influence faded not through destruction, but through irrelevance. Emperors listened when convenient and ignored it when necessary. Julianus's reign had shown how little resistance the Senate could offer when fear took hold. That lesson lingered longer than anyone liked to admit. For the people, history simplified itself. Julianus became a symbol rather than a man. Children heard that an emperor once bought Rome and lost it almost immediately. The moral was clear even if the details were wrong. Stories do not aim for accuracy, they aim for survival. And the story survived. In moments of political tension, when bribes grew too bold or ambition too visible, someone would invoke the past. Not loudly, just enough to remind others that Rome had seen this end before. That reminder often worked. Sometimes it did not. Empires, like people, repeat mistakes with variations. What made Julianus different was not just what he did, but how quickly the consequences followed. There was no long reign to soften judgment, no accomplishments to complicate memory. His rise and fall were clean, brutal, and undeniable. That clarity made him useful to history, useful as a warning, useful as an example, useful as proof that systems matter, but individuals still choose. In the end, Rome did not remember Julianus because he failed. Rome remembered him because he revealed the moment when power stopped pretending to be sacred and briefly admitted it could be sold. Once that truth was exposed, it could never be hidden again, only managed. And so the empire marched on, stronger in some ways, colder in others, carrying forward a lesson learned too late for one man, but just in time for the machine that would outlive him.
In the long memory of Rome, moments of revelation mattered more than moments of glory. Victories faded, conquests blurred together, names of distant enemies were forgotten, but the moments when Rome understood itself, those endured. The reign of Julianus became one such moment, quietly shaping the instincts of power long after his bones had turned to dust. By the third generation after his death, few could recite his full name. Fewer still could place his reign precisely in time. Yet the idea he represented remained sharp. When officials whispered about ambition outrunning legitimacy, they were speaking of him without saying so. When generals demanded loyalty before loyalty was offered, they were acting on a lesson learned in his shadow. Even language adapted. In political speech, certain phrases acquired double meanings. To bid too openly became a warning. To trust the guards became a joke that carried no humor. Everyone understood the references. Everyone knew where they came from. The empire had institutionalized memory. Legal scholars argued that the events of that year justified stronger executive authority. Moralists argued the opposite, that unchecked power invited decay. Both sides used Julianus as evidence, shaping his brief life into arguments he never intended to make.
He had become useful in death in ways he never was in life. In the military academies that emerged under later emperors, instructors spoke bluntly. They taught that loyalty must be earned daily, that soldiers followed leaders who shared risk, not leaders who purchased compliance. Julianus's name appeared not as a villain, but as a case study in failure without malice. That distinction mattered. Rome had plenty of monsters. Julianus was not one of them. He had not ruled long enough to become cruel. His failure was intellectual, a misunderstanding of what power was made of. That made him more dangerous as an example and more valuable as a warning. Across the empire, local rulers internalized the lesson differently. Some became harsher, believing fear was the only reliable currency. Others became more generous, hoping loyalty could be cultivated before it was tested. Both approaches traced their logic, consciously or not, to the same origin, the knowledge that legitimacy, once lost, could not be bought back. Over time, the story grew simpler. Details vanished, motives flattened. What remained was the shape of the tale: a man, a throne, gold, and collapse. The simplicity gave it power. It could be told quickly, remembered easily, and applied widely. That was how Rome taught itself, not through moral purity, but through survival narratives. When the empire later faced crises far greater than Julianus's reign, foreign invasions, economic collapse, internal fracture, leaders still reached backwards for guidance. They did not ask what Julianus would have done. They asked what he had misunderstood. That question mattered, because Rome was not destroyed by him, it was warned by him. The city endured plagues, fires, and sackings. Emperors arose who were crueler, weaker, or more reckless, yet none repeated his exact mistake. The throne would be seized, inherited, manipulated, but never again openly sold. That boundary held for centuries. In that sense, Julianus succeeded where he failed. His downfall hardened the empire against a particular kind of decay. Other forms would come, others always did, but this one had been exposed too clearly to be repeated without shame. At the end of it all, when Rome itself became memory rather than power, historians looked back with colder eyes. They saw Julianus not as a tragedy, but as a symptom, a flare fired into the night, illuminating structural weakness for a brief, unforgettable moment. And like all flares, he burned brightly, briefly, and left darkness sharper than before. Yet even in that darkness, the empire remembered how to see.
By the time the empire reached its later decades, Julianus's reign had become legend, not in grand monuments or epic poems, but in quiet, persistent memory. Soldiers, bureaucrats, and citizens alike referenced the episode as a lesson in limits. It was no longer about him as a man, but about the consequences of misunderstanding Rome itself. A throne, it was said, could be coveted, won, or even stolen, but it could never be purchased without peril. Severus's reforms endured. The army remained loyal, the Senate cautious, and the city alive. Coins minted during Julianus's brief tenure were melted and reshaped, yet fragments remained, hidden in pockets or buried beneath homes. These remnants became talismans, small reminders that power demanded more than wealth. Children playing near the forum might uncover a bronze coin and hear an old storyteller whisper, "Once Rome's throne was for sale." The story persisted not to mock, but to educate. In private quarters of emperors who followed, advisors invoked the tale with quiet insistence. "Remember Didius Julianus," they would say, not as a curse, not as flattery, but as a practical principle. Do not mistake luck for legitimacy. Do not substitute gold for loyalty, and do not presume the city will endure your whims. Lessons like these shaped strategy, governance, and survival, embedding themselves invisibly into the mechanisms of empire. Even Rome itself seemed to respond. The city, ever alive, adapted to its rulers. Markets flourished when leadership was strong.
Streets remained orderly when soldiers maintained discipline, and citizens observed quietly when they sensed instability. The pulse of the empire now measured not only the whims of emperors, but also the consequences of errors like Julianus. One brief reign, less than 3 months long, had recalibrated the expectations of an entire civilization. Over the centuries, historians debated the meaning of his auction. Some painted Julianus as a fool, unfit for the highest office. Others framed him as a product of systemic decay, a mirror reflecting the vulnerabilities of Rome itself. Both perspectives carried truth. The emperor had acted logically according to the rules he perceived, but Rome's true rules, the unspoken codes of loyalty and force, he had ignored, and in that ignorance, the empire remembered its fragility. Artifacts of his reign faded, but memory endured. Statues were replaced, coins were reminted, palaces were renovated, yet the story survived in whispers, in letters, in histories written long after the purple robes had gone. For students of power, it became a case study, the moment Rome treated sovereignty as a commodity and the inevitable collapse that followed. For generals and politicians, it became a warning. Authority cannot be rented, loyalty cannot be bought, and legitimacy must be earned daily. By the end of his story, Didius Julianus had achieved a form of immortality he never anticipated. Not as a conqueror, not as a legislator, not as a celebrated ruler, but as a symbol. His rise and fall illuminated the principles that truly held Rome together. Gold could win temporary obedience, but it could never replace trust, respect, and the silent force of belief. In this lesson, the empire found its endearing strength, one that would carry it through centuries of conquest, corruption, and crisis. And so, the brief 9-week reign of Didius Julianus became eternal in memory. A single act, a throne sold to the highest bidder, shaped generations of governance, strategy, and caution. Rome had survived, not because of him, but because of what he revealed. The empire's lessons were written in the lives of those who came after, guided by fear, wisdom, and the knowledge that power without legitimacy is nothing more than fragile illusion. The city continued, alive and sprawling as it had for centuries. Emperors rose and fell, wars were fought and forgotten, yet the echo of that spring remained, a lesson in gold, ambition, and the fragile human hearts that wield both. And somewhere in the quiet corners of memory, the story of a man who bought the throne and lost everything remained a warning that Rome would never again forget.
Time stretched, and the empire solidified lessons learned from that spring of 193 AD. Rome had endured assassinations, rebellions, and civil strife, yet none so openly displayed the dangers of transactional ambition. The brief reign of Didius Julianus became a cautionary tale whispered in corridors, repeated in the training grounds, and studied in the chambers of governance. Generals recalled it when loyalty wavered, magistrates invoked it when greed appeared, and emperors remembered it each time they considered shortcuts to power. Even in the provinces, far from the marble halls of the capital, the lesson traveled. Governors who once might have sold offices or privileges to maintain influence thought twice. Legions, trained to enforce loyalty with discipline rather than bribes, observed carefully how quickly a ruler's fortune could shift if wealth was mistaken for authority. Across the empire, the subtle understanding emerged. Rome was a living organism, and any misstep in its balance could cascade into disaster. Julianus had been a test, one the empire passed only narrowly, and the memory of that failure hardened the system against future corruption. Among the citizens, stories persisted not as chronicles, but as cultural memory. Tavern owners told the tale of the emperor who bought the throne as a lesson to the young men eager for power and the older men who remembered it too vividly. Poets hinted at it in verse, philosophers used it as a moral lesson, and artists encoded it in mosaics and frescoes, often subtly, in the form of coins being weighed or soldiers counting gold. The ephemeral nature of Julianus's power made it more potent than long reigns. It was a singular shock,
a sudden demonstration of the consequences of misjudging Rome's true mechanisms. In the political sphere, the Senate and magistrates developed new behaviors in response. They became more cautious, more deliberate. Public declarations were tempered with thought, alliances with scrutiny, and rewards with conditions. No one wanted to repeat the spectacle of the emperor purchased only to see him toppled within weeks. The political machinery of Rome adjusted slowly, as it always did, absorbing the lessons from Julianus's failure like a wound that left a scar across the collective consciousness. Severus himself, while consolidating power, often reflected on the brief, ill-fated reign he had ended. He understood that Julianus's failure was not purely personal, but symptomatic of a system that rewarded the appearance of compliance over genuine loyalty. He strengthened the institutions, reformed the Praetorian Guard, and created a precedent that power could only be held through competence, discipline, and legitimacy. In essence, Julianus had taught the empire the rules it would follow for decades, rules that no emperor could ignore without risking catastrophe. In quieter moments, historians would look back on that season with a mixture of awe and incredulity. Few events in Roman history demonstrated so clearly how quickly ambition, wealth, and miscalculation could converge to destroy even the highest office. Julianus's 9-week tenure became more than a historical footnote. It became a symbol of vulnerability, an example used repeatedly to illustrate that Rome, though mighty, was not invincible to human folly. Even centuries later, when the empire had expanded, contracted, and weathered countless storms, the story of Didius Julianus survived in academic texts and oral histories. It reminded leaders and citizens alike that while the throne might appear attainable through cunning or bribery, real authority was measured by the hearts, minds, and loyalty of those who served it. Julianus's story, as short as it was, crystallized a fundamental truth. In Rome, power could be gained, but it could never be purchased without cost.
The empire, having internalized the shock of Julianus's reign, moved forward with an unspoken vigilance. The city itself seemed to hum with a memory of caution. Every forum, temple, and street carried echoes of that brief, unsettling moment when power had been sold. Citizens went about their lives, yet beneath the surface lingered a wariness, a subtle understanding that Rome's survival required more than obedience. It demanded judgment, integrity, and vigilance. In the imperial palace, successors observed the subtle markers of legitimacy with care. Advisors reminded emperors that wealth could sway opinions temporarily, but belief could only be earned. Policies were scrutinized not just for their immediate effect, but for their impact on perception and loyalty. In effect, Julianus's failure became a blueprint for consolidating authority. Spend not only on gold, but on trust. Cultivate not only compliance, but conviction. Even the army incorporated the lesson. Officers trained their soldiers with an emphasis on discipline and shared purpose, rather than mere reward. They taught that loyalty acquired by gold alone would evaporate under stress. Generals repeated the story of Julianus in their training exercises, emphasizing the fragility of purchased obedience. Rome's legions learned that true command required more than money. It required respect, confidence, and the unshakable understanding that their cause was just. Philosophers and historians also seized upon Julianus's example. They debated endlessly. Was he a fool, a product of circumstance, or a mirror held up to an empire's weakness? Each interpretation carried weight. In lecture halls and academies, students analyzed his choices, pondering what it meant to hold power in a world where appearances often outweighed substance. The empire's intellectual elite understood that while emperors might rise and fall, the lessons of miscalculation endured indefinitely. Meanwhile, Rome's citizens absorbed the story in quieter, more personal ways. Parents told children about the dangers of valuing wealth over virtue. Merchants mused about the impermanence of favor. Soldiers and officials alike internalized the cautionary tale as a guide for navigating the delicate balance between opportunity and consequence.
Julianus's fleeting reign became a symbol, a lesson woven into the social fabric. The allure of immediate power carries hidden dangers that no one can ignore. Across the provinces, the ripple effects persisted. Governors and local rulers learned to respect the chain of authority, knowing that the empire had previously punished deviation with swift precision. The story of an emperor bought and lost traveled far beyond Rome's borders, shaping how power was perceived and exercised. It reminded every leader, every citizen, and every soldier that authority, though sometimes challenged or misused, required legitimacy that could not be improvised or purchased. Julianus's brief rule, though short-lived, thus gained enduring significance. It had exposed the vulnerabilities of Rome, tested the empire's structures, and ultimately reinforced the principles of governance and loyalty. The empire survived because it learned, adapted, and institutionalized the lessons of that spring. And while Julianus himself had perished, his story remained, a stark reminder of what happens when ambition outpaces prudence and when gold is mistaken for authority. As decades passed, the memory of Julianus's reign became less about the man and more about the consequences he revealed. Rome, vast and sprawling, carried with it a network of lessons learned through experience, and his auctioned throne was one of the sharpest. Emperors who followed understood instinctively that no display of wealth could substitute for authority, no flattery could replace discipline, and no temporary loyalty could endure against the momentum of fear and ambition. Julianus's failure was taught not as history alone, but as a constant guide for survival. The empire's machinery adapted. Laws were rewritten to strengthen imperial authority and clarify succession. The Praetorian Guard, once kingmakers, were reformed to prevent the recurrence of bribery and corruption. Commanders, both in Rome and in the provinces, emphasized unity and shared risk over transactional obedience. Soldiers were trained to respect the office, not the offer, and generals were reminded that loyalty bought cheaply dissolves under pressure. In this way, the empire institutionalized a lesson learned in blood, ensuring that no emperor could replicate the errors of Julianus without catastrophic consequences. Culturally, the episode shaped the perception of power. Poets and storytellers told the tale of the emperor who purchased his crown, emphasizing the absurdity, the hubris, and the inevitability of his downfall. Philosophers debated the ethical dimensions of his act, questioning whether it was ambition, desperation, or greed that had driven him. Yet every version, whether fictionalized or chronicled, carried the same central warning: power without legitimacy is fragile, transient, and dangerous. The narrative seeped into every corner of Roman life, shaping expectations and reinforcing the moral architecture of the empire. Even Severus, decades after consolidating his rule, kept Julianus's story close to his mind. He used it not merely as justification for his reforms, but as a constant reminder of the fragility of authority. Advisors who suggested shortcuts or indulgences were often reminded of the man who thought gold could buy obedience. The emperor knew that an empire's survival relied on a delicate equilibrium: respect earned through competence, loyalty maintained through discipline, and fear wielded sparingly, only to reinforce legitimacy rather than replace it. In this way, Julianus's legacy endured. The throne he bought and lost, the fear he inspired, and the lesson his downfall imparted became woven into the fabric of Rome's governance, culture, and collective memory. Gold could sway a moment, ambition could seize an opportunity, but in the intricate dance of empire, authority demanded more. And as the centuries unfolded, the empire that survived him never forgot the truth he revealed: that power, once purchased rather than earned, is always fleeting, and that history favors those who understand its rules before they act.
Over the years, Julianus's reign became more than a story. It became a standard by which emperors, generals, and citizens measured political risk. The auction of the throne, though brief and chaotic, demonstrated in sharp relief what happened when the mechanisms of power were misunderstood. Rome learned that money could influence actions, but could never secure genuine loyalty. The empire itself, vast and often unruly, adapted to this lesson,
embedding it into the unwritten rules of governance and control. In Rome, the Senate slowly regained some influence, but it operated differently. Senators understood that open resistance could provoke legions and that passive complicity could invite chaos. They became adept at reading power, negotiating discreetly, and safeguarding their positions without openly challenging authority. The story of Julianus, repeated in whispers and letters, served as a constant reminder that appearances could be deceiving and that timing, support, and legitimacy were far more important than wealth or ambition. Across the provinces, commanders and governors incorporated the lesson into their own leadership practices. Soldiers were reminded that obedience bought with bribes dissolved under stress. Governors understood that promises of personal gain were fleeting without the structure of authority to reinforce them. And in distant corners of the empire, even local magistrates cited Julianus's failure as a guide to maintaining balance between personal ambition and the responsibilities of office. What had once been an isolated disaster became an enduring framework for governance. Culturally, Julianus's memory persisted in art, literature, and public discourse. Poets referenced him obliquely, using allegory and satire to highlight the folly of valuing wealth over judgment. Historians debated the ethical and structural causes of his failure, examining the interplay of human ambition, institutional weakness, and the ephemeral nature of loyalty. Over time, these discussions shaped the moral and intellectual climate of Rome, emphasizing prudence, foresight, and the limits of transactional power. Even among the Praetorian Guard, lessons were internalized. The men who had once sold the empire were either punished or reformed under Severus's leadership. Subsequent guards were trained to understand that their influence carried risk and responsibility. The idea that an army could act as a marketplace for power became anathema. Discipline, loyalty, and accountability replaced opportunism, cementing a structural reform that would influence the Guard for generations. For Severus and his successors, the reign of Julianus was a constant reminder of vulnerability. Every decision, every appointment, every interaction with soldiers or senators carried the shadow of the man who thought gold could substitute for legitimacy. Policies were crafted with care. Rewards were tied to service, not promise alone. Threats were wielded judiciously, ensuring obedience while maintaining respect. Rome became a stronger, more deliberate empire because of the memory of a reign that, though brief, had threatened its stability so openly. In private and public, Julianus's story endured as a lesson. It was repeated in speeches, echoed in legal texts, and cited in military instruction. Emperors knew that even a single miscalculation could unravel authority. Governors and magistrates understood that legitimacy could not be purchased. Citizens, aware of the story through hearsay, observed the mechanisms of power with greater caution. The empire's social, political, and military structures had internalized the lesson. Authority demanded respect, earned through competence, loyalty nurtured through consistency, and vigilance sustained over time. By the end of the century, Didius Julianus was no longer remembered as a man, but as a principle. His 9-week reign was distilled into a moral and political framework that shaped the Roman world far more than his actions could have suggested. He demonstrated that the allure of immediate power carries hidden dangers, and that an empire, no matter how vast, can survive only if its rulers understand the delicate balance between influence, legitimacy, and loyalty.
By the 2nd century's end, the reverberations of Julianus's brief reign had become fully integrated into the DNA of the empire. His name was no longer prominent in inscriptions or public records, yet the lessons from his failure shaped the behaviors of every office, every military campaign, and every political maneuver. Emperors approached succession with careful strategy. Advisors emphasized the importance of earned loyalty over fleeting influence. Generals drilled the principle of commitment into their soldiers. Obedience bought was obedience lost at the first challenge. Rome itself seemed to internalize the lesson, beyond even the actions of its rulers. Citizens began to recognize the fragile nature of authority. The story of the emperor who purchased power became part of the cultural consciousness, woven into proverbs, street conversations, and moral instruction. Parents used it to warn children, merchants to caution apprentices, and soldiers to guide recruits. The tale was no longer just history, it was practical knowledge, shaping the everyday choices of those who lived under Rome's rule. Historians in subsequent decades repeatedly examined the 193 AD auction with a mixture of fascination and dread. They debated whether Julianus was a product of circumstance or a symptom of institutional weakness. Philosophers argued about the ethical implications, considering whether he had acted out of desperation, ambition, or ignorance. Military scholars focused on the implications for command, obedience, and the delicate balance between wealth and power. Through these discussions, the empire's understanding of governance matured. Julianus's reign had not lasted long, but it left an indelible mark on Roman thought and administration. The Praetorian Guard, forever associated with the auction, became a case study in accountability. Severus's reforms, executing the worst offenders, restructuring recruitment, and enforcing strict discipline, ensured that the Guard could never again treat the emperor's authority as a commodity. Future emperors remembered the lesson. A military force without discipline and loyalty could topple a ruler faster than any foreign invader. Soldiers were trained not just for battle, but for the ethical responsibility of wielding power wisely, understanding that their actions could determine the survival of the empire itself. Even in distant provinces, far from Rome's marble palaces, the story carried weight. Governors, magistrates, and military leaders spoke of Julianus as a warning, emphasizing that authority could not be secured with bribery, flattery, or opportunism. Legions, often stationed in volatile regions, used the story as a teaching tool, a caution against ambition divorced from legitimacy, and a lesson in the consequences of misjudging the empire's underlying structures. Julianus's failure became an example for decades, proving that the missteps of one man could ripple across the entire system. Culturally, his reign remained a potent symbol. Poets, playwrights, and philosophers referenced him subtly, often without naming him, portraying the folly of attempting to shortcut power through wealth. Artists encoded the lesson in mosaics and frescoes, hinting at the impermanence of fortune and the necessity of earned respect. Even in these subtle forms, the story retained its moral clarity. Authority could not be purchased. Gold could momentarily influence behavior, but it could never replace genuine loyalty or legitimacy. By now, Julianus's story had achieved a unique status. It was not just remembered, but utilized. Every emperor, every governor, every general knew the warning it carried. Leadership required foresight, courage, and awareness of the delicate balance between opportunity and responsibility. The empire had survived because it had learned from one man's miscalculation, internalizing the truth that power, once bought instead of earned, is fleeting and dangerous. And so, the brief 9-week reign of Didius Julianus became more than a historical footnote. It became a principle, an enduring lesson, and a symbol of the fragile intersection between ambition, wealth, and authority, a warning carried forward in the minds, policies, and actions of generations of Romans.
As the decades passed, the empire became increasingly aware of the subtle, lasting effects of Julianus's reign. His name was rarely invoked aloud in official proclamations, yet the memory of his failure lingered in the routines, rituals, and politics of Rome. The lesson was clear and pervasive. Authority that relied solely on wealth or the acquiescence of others was doomed to collapse. The empire internalized this lesson, shaping both its leadership and the expectations of its citizens. In the capital, the Senate evolved to reflect this understanding. Senators learned that compliance could not be coerced with bribery or flattery. They adapted to the new reality, offering counsel when necessary, but avoiding public challenges that could provoke instability. Their role became more about guidance and subtle influence rather than overt control, ensuring that the governance of Rome remained stable, even if it meant quietly bending to the will of the emperor. Julianus's short-lived authority had taught them that hesitation, indecision, or misplaced loyalty could unravel centuries of governance. The army, the backbone of Rome, also transformed. Generals drilled lessons into their soldiers. Loyalty could not be bought, and obedience purchased with coin would dissolve under pressure. Training emphasized unity, discipline, and respect for legitimate command. Soldiers were taught to recognize the difference between a leader who earned loyalty and one who attempted to purchase it. In this way, the empire reduced the risk of internal betrayal, ensuring that the military would support the state rather than transient ambitions. The story of Julianus, whispered in barracks and echoed across training grounds, became a practical guide for survival and effectiveness. Across the provinces, governors and magistrates internalized the lesson as well. They observed the dangers of assuming authority could be manipulated through bribery or favoritism. Local officials, seeking to maintain control and influence, implemented checks, balances, and careful supervision of subordinate offices. The brief chaos of Julianus's rule served as a model of what happens when systems fail and ambition is left unchecked. Even far from Rome, the narrative shaped behavior, ensuring that the empire's far-reaching governance structure remained cohesive and resilient. In cultural memory, Julianus's reign continued to resonate. Poets and historians depicted him as a cautionary figure, often without naming him directly. His failure was used as a tool for teaching morality, governance, and strategic thinking. In classrooms, the story illustrated the interplay between ambition, legitimacy, and loyalty. Philosophers debated whether his actions were morally wrong or simply an inevitable outcome of a system that allowed such opportunities. These discussions enriched Roman thought and institutional wisdom, creating a deeper, enduring understanding of the nature of power. Even the Praetorian Guard, whose actions had contributed so directly to Julianus's rise and fall, remained cautious. Reforms enacted by Severus limited their influence, emphasized discipline, and instilled the principle that their loyalty had boundaries. The notion that soldiers could sell the empire for profit was eliminated from practice, replaced by rigorous training, oversight, and consequences for disloyalty. The lesson was deeply ingrained. The empire could not survive if its protectors treated authority as a commodity. Julianus's brief tenure had revealed the fragility of the system, but the empire survived because it learned from that fragility. Power required legitimacy. Leadership demanded competence and foresight. Wealth alone could not sustain a ruler, and fleeting obedience was insufficient to secure the loyalty of an empire. The story of his 9-week reign became a principle of governance, a guide for emperors, soldiers, and citizens alike, a symbol that Rome, though vast and enduring, depended on the wisdom to understand the limits of power. In this way, Didius Julianus's memory endured far beyond the 9 weeks he occupied the throne. He became more than a historical footnote. He became a lesson etched into the very structure of Roman authority, a reminder that ambition untempered by wisdom, wealth unbacked by legitimacy, and authority unsupported by belief will inevitably fail.
By the late 2nd century, the story of Didius Julianus had transcended mere history. It had become a framework through which Rome measured both leaders and institutions. Emperors, generals, and officials understood that power demanded more than wealth, ambition, or opportunity. It required legitimacy, earned loyalty, and careful stewardship. The auction of the throne, brief and chaotic as it had been, remained a reference point for the mechanics of authority across the empire. The Senate, once a body of significant power, had evolved under the lessons of that spring. Senators understood the delicate balance between influence and survival. Open defiance could provoke military backlash, while passive complicity could invite chaos. The memory of Julianus's brief tenure served as a constant reminder that misjudgment could topple even the highest office within weeks. Consequently, political maneuvering became subtler, with negotiation, foresight, and prudence valued above audacious ambition or opportunistic gain. The empire, through institutional memory, became more stable and resilient. The military integrated the lesson in tangible ways. Officers trained their soldiers to differentiate between leaders who commanded respect and those who relied on temporary influence. Discipline, unity, and loyalty became central tenets, reinforced by drills, oaths, and careful supervision. Julianus's brief tenure illustrated the dangers of transactional obedience. A leader who purchased compliance would find it evaporating the moment real challenges arose. Legions learned that authority is not inherited through gold, but earned through example, foresight, and consistent leadership. Across the provinces, the story also shaped governance. Governors and magistrates internalized the cautionary tale, recognizing that even distant from Rome, the repercussions of poor judgment could echo throughout the empire. The auction of the throne became a model for the consequences of ambition divorced from legitimacy. Officials implemented safeguards, monitored loyalty, and cultivated respect among those they ruled, ensuring that mistakes similar to Julianus's were avoided. The lesson became embedded in policy, culture, and institutional behavior. Culturally, Julianus's reign endured as both moral lesson and practical guide. Poets, historians, and philosophers analyzed his decisions, debating whether he had acted out of desperation, hubris, or systemic weakness. Artists encoded the story in mosaics and frescoes, often subtly depicting gold weighed against authority or soldiers hesitating before a commander. Public discourse used the tale as a touchstone for teaching morality, prudence, and the limits of ambition. Even when his name was omitted, the principles of his failure were never forgotten. The Praetorian Guard, central to the events of 193 AD, was restructured permanently. Severus's reforms eliminated their capacity to act as kingmakers for personal profit. Discipline, accountability, and loyalty to the state, rather than to the highest bidder, became the guiding rules. Soldiers learned that the empire depended on their integrity, that their power carried responsibility, and that past mistakes were not to be repeated. The memory of Julianus's brief rule reinforced a culture of vigilance within Rome's military elite. Ultimately, Julianus's 9-week reign achieved an unintended form of immortality. He did not shape the empire through conquest, law, or infrastructure, but through the clarity of his failure. He revealed the fragility inherent in authority purchased rather than earned, and in doing so provided a lesson that shaped centuries of Roman governance, military practice, and cultural memory. In Rome, power could not be bought, loyalty could not be rented, and the empire, learning from him, endured. As the empire moved further into the 3rd century, the legacy of Didius Julianus became more subtle, yet no less influential. His brief 9-week rule was no longer a scandal whispered only in Rome. It had become a guiding principle in the architecture of power. Emperors understood instinctively that legitimacy could not be purchased, that loyalty required cultivation, and that wealth alone could not secure the empire's stability. The lessons of that chaotic spring were ingrained into both the structures of governance and the psyche of Rome. In Rome itself, citizens observed these lessons indirectly. Markets thrived under disciplined oversight, public officials were held to clear standards, and military presence was visible yet controlled. The collective consciousness of the city had internalized the dangers of transactional leadership. People recognized that the illusion of authority could be as dangerous as its absence, and that even a brief miscalculation at the top could ripple across the empire. Julianus's reign became a cautionary tale embedded in the rhythms of daily life, shaping behavior far beyond the halls of power. The Senate, now more circumspect than ever, operated under this memory. Senators spoke cautiously, measured their words, and calculated the weight of every public declaration. Political maneuvers became subtler, alliances carefully cultivated, and overt opportunism discouraged by the memory of Julianus's rapid fall. The body that once tried to influence succession through overt action had learned to act indirectly, ensuring stability while preserving some semblance of influence. Julianus's error had transformed not only how emperors ruled, but also how those around them maneuvered. The military, too, internalized the lesson. Soldiers were trained to recognize the difference between a commander with genuine authority and one who relied on influence bought through gifts or promises. Generals emphasized unity, discipline, and the cultivation of respect, knowing that obedience purchased could dissolve at the first challenge. Across the legions, Julianus's failure became a foundational example. The emperor who bought loyalty quickly discovered that authority without legitimacy could not survive. It was a lesson repeated in exercises, drills, and storytelling within camps across the empire. In distant provinces, governors and local officials carried the memory of Julianus as a guiding principle. They saw how fragile authority could be, even far from Rome, and implemented checks and systems to ensure their power was grounded in law, respect, and institutional support. Ambition without legitimacy, they learned, could bring swift and irreversible consequences. The brief chaos of his reign became an enduring model of failure, used to reinforce prudence, oversight, and measured decision-making across the empire. Culturally, Julianus's story evolved into moral and philosophical reflection. Poets, dramatists, and historians drew lessons from his rise and fall, portraying him as a symbol of ambition untempered by wisdom. Philosophers debated whether he had been morally culpable or merely a product of a system that allowed opportunity to exceed judgment. Even centuries later, artists encoded his lesson in mosaics, frescoes, and coins, depicting scenes of imbalance between wealth and authority, subtly reminding viewers of the peril in trying to shortcut power. Through all this, the Praetorian Guard remained a critical instrument of stability. Severus's reforms ensured that they could no longer manipulate succession for profit. Discipline, accountability, and loyalty became central to their training, and the lessons of Julianus's brief rule were instilled across generations. Soldiers learned that authority, once undermined, could destabilize the empire, and that their own actions could either safeguard or destroy the foundations of Rome. Thus, Julianus's short, chaotic reign left an enduring mark, not through conquest, legislation, or public works, but through a clear and enduring lesson. Power cannot be bought, authority must be earned, loyalty must be cultivated. His failure, observed and internalized, strengthened the empire by teaching what it could not afford to repeat. In that way, Didius Julianus achieved a kind of immortality. He became a principle woven into the heart of Roman governance, a lesson carried forward for generations.
By the mid-3rd century, the story of Didius Julianus had become an almost invisible scaffolding for the governance of Rome. Though few could recall his name with exact clarity, the principles his failure illustrated were embedded into every level of administration, military command, and civic expectation. Leaders no longer debated whether wealth could substitute for legitimacy. The answer was already internalized. The empire had learned that authority demanded earned respect, cultivated loyalty, and consistent demonstration of competence, lessons crystallized by one man's short-lived ambition. In Rome, the citizens lived under these rules without always recognizing them. Markets continued, public offices functioned, and the legions patrolled the streets, but the city itself had adopted a cautious vigilance. People understood that power was fragile, that sudden changes in leadership could ripple across society, and that appearances often masked danger. Stories of the auctioned throne circulated in taverns, workshops, and schools, not as gossip, but as enduring lessons, that ambition, when divorced from legitimacy, could be catastrophic. Julianus's reign had become a quiet moral force, shaping public consciousness long after his fall. The Senate, tempered by the memory of that chaotic spring, exercised its influence with careful strategy. Senators learned to act indirectly, to counsel with subtlety, and to avoid overt challenges that might provoke instability. Their influence shifted from bold interventions to guiding principles, shaping laws and administrative decisions behind the scenes. The story of Julianus reminded them constantly that miscalculations at the top could have immediate and irreversible consequences, and that patience and prudence were essential virtues in a world of ambition and intrigue. In the military, Julianus's failure became foundational to training and command. Officers emphasized the distinction between true authority and purchased obedience. Soldiers learned that loyalty could not be rented, and that the collapse of leadership often followed misjudgment and ambition unchecked. Across legions in distant provinces, the example of the man who bought the throne became a repeated lesson in the importance of discipline, cohesion, and respect. The military, reinforced by the scars of past mistakes, became the stabilizing backbone of the empire. Provincial administrators also internalized the lesson. Governors who once might have tempted bribery or favoritism understood that the consequences of undermining legitimate authority could be swift and irreversible. Policies were enacted to reinforce the law, accountability, and oversight, and systems were established to prevent the repetition of similar errors. Julianus's brief, chaotic reign became a touchstone in the education of civic and military officials alike, a reminder that ambition must be tempered by wisdom, and that authority built on convenience rather than legitimacy would collapse. Culturally, his story persisted in subtle yet profound ways. Historians, philosophers, and poets used it as a lens to examine power, ambition, and morality. Plays and writings often referenced a ruler who miscalculated by trusting coin over competence, weaving the lesson into both education and entertainment. Art and literature subtly encoded his example, portraying the tension between wealth, ambition, and authority. Even centuries later, the lesson of Julianus influenced the ways in which Romans thought about leadership, loyalty, and the impermanence of fortune. The Praetorian Guard, reshaped and reformed, carried the echoes of that short reign. Its members were disciplined to understand the consequences of overreach. Soldiers learned that their own power could not become a commodity without threatening the empire itself. Julianus's downfall became a lesson in responsibility, both for rulers and those entrusted with enforcing their authority. Ultimately, the 9-week reign of Didius Julianus survived not because of his actions, but because of their consequences. His story became a principle. Authority cannot be bought, loyalty cannot be rented, and the weight of power must always be tempered by legitimacy. The empire endured because it learned from his mistakes, embedding the lesson into governance, military strategy, and civic culture. Through his failure, Rome grew stronger, more deliberate, and wiser.
By the time the 3rd century advanced further, Didius Julianus had become less a man and more an enduring idea, a lesson woven into the fabric of Rome itself. His 9-week reign, brief and chaotic, continued to shape the empire long after his death. The auction of the throne had revealed a fundamental truth. Power could be seized momentarily, but legitimacy could not be bought. Authority, whether in the hands of emperors, generals, or governors, required the respect of those it governed, the loyalty of those who enforced it, and the wisdom to wield it responsibly. Rome, as a living entity, had internalized this lesson deeply. Citizens, officials, and soldiers alike operated under an implicit understanding that ambition unchecked by prudence could destabilize the entire system. Markets thrived not only through trade, but because laws and order were enforced consistently. Governors administered with care, knowing that misjudgment, even in remote provinces, could have repercussions far beyond their immediate reach. Soldiers and generals practiced loyalty and discipline, aware that obedience purchased through reward alone could dissolve under challenge. Every corner of the empire carried traces of Julianus's cautionary example. Even cultural memory preserved the lesson in subtle ways. Historians wrote of his brief reign as a turning point in Roman governance, philosophers debated its moral and structural implications, and artists encoded its warnings in frescoes and mosaics. Teachers passed the story to students as a guide for understanding authority, loyalty, and consequence. Over time, the narrative was simplified, distilled into a universal truth. Ambition without wisdom,
Wealth without legitimacy and authority without loyalty are doomed to fail. Julianus's 9 weeks became an eternal principle embedded in the empire's consciousness. The Praetorian Guard, whose betrayal had made Julianus's rise possible, became a permanent symbol of the dangers of unchecked power. Reforms enacted under Severus and his successors ensured that soldiers could no longer manipulate succession for personal gain. Discipline, accountability, and vigilance became central to the Guard's culture. Julianus's failure was repeated in stories, training, and instruction, ensuring that the empire's protectors understood both their power and its limits. For emperors who came after, the lesson was always present. Decisions were measured not by immediate advantage, but by long-term legitimacy. Rewards were tied to service, not promise alone. Alliances were carefully nurtured, and influence was wielded with prudence. In private, advisors reminded rulers of the fleeting nature of purchased obedience and the fragility of power without legitimacy. The empire's survival depended not on the absence of ambition, but on the wisdom to manage it, and Julianus's reign remained the clearest demonstration of what could happen when that wisdom was absent. Over the centuries, his story endured not as a tale of villainy or heroism, but as a principle of governance. Didius Julianus, the emperor who bought the throne and lost it almost immediately, became an eternal warning. Authority must be earned, loyalty nurtured, and power respected. Wealth alone cannot create obedience, and ambition without judgment can destroy even the mightiest of empires. And so the empire marched on, vast, resilient, and ever aware. Its citizens, soldiers, and leaders carried forward a wisdom forged in the chaos of one man's brief, ill-fated reign. The shadow of Julianus remained, not as a curse, but as a teacher. His failure had been Rome's gain, his brief rise an enduring lesson in the art of power. Through that lesson, the empire endured, wiser, stronger, and more deliberate than ever before. The throne could not be bought, loyalty could not be rented, authority demanded legitimacy, and in that knowledge, Rome found its enduring strength.